The United States presidential elections held in November 2020 impassioned the populace. Millions of people watched intently and argued over who would win. Heated debates erupted between Biden and Trump supporters. Nothing too unusual for election season, except that in this case, we're talking about the citizens of Russia. This is not a joke or exaggeration. More than half of Russians, 53%, followed the 2020 US elections, and not because Russians love politics. In contrast, a recent poll showed that only 55% of Russians plan to participate in the upcoming State Duma elections at the end of 2021. In other words, Russians are about as interested in their own elections as they are in American ones. Actually, it's not entirely surprising. Nothing is very engaging about following elections with rigged outcomes. What you might call insanity, Putin calls stability. How is this possible? Let's take a look. A few interesting facts. For more than 20 years, Russia has been ruled by a paranoid president, convinced that enemies surround him. According to the Kremlin, events in Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, and the protest movements in Russia are the direct result of Western influence. Putin and his supporters believe that stability is only achievable with Putin in power. Without him, the country would immediately collapse. The Russian president appoints nearly all governors, and he can remove them at any time. The opposition is not permitted to participate in the elections, and results are falsified. Clearly, fair elections are a significant risk for Putin. As if one seriously believes that enemies abound, a transfer of power is impossible. The result is that elections become heavily orchestrated events. So when it comes to election results, all's fair in love and war. In 2008, Dmitry Medvedev was elected president, but Putin actually retained power. Soon after taking office, Medvedev extended the presidential term from 4 to 6 years, beginning from the next inauguration, when he ceded the throne to Putin. No real competitor of Putin's is allowed to participate in presidential elections. In 2018, the Central Election Committee refused to register Alexey Navalny, who was running a legitimate cross-country election campaign. In what could only be described as a farce, the Kremlin appointed Putin's goddaughter, Ksenia Sobchak, to run as a liberal candidate. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly stated that he would never change the constitution to remain in power forever. However, in 2020, he did just that by zeroing his previous presidential terms. This means that Putin can now legitimately rule until at least 2036. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. A thrilling plot is now developing ahead of the State Duma elections. As Putin and his ruling party United Russia see their approval ratings fall in advance of the election, more fraud and manipulation will be employed. This can be described as managed democracy. Just listen to the sound of those two words. Managed democracy. There had never really been free and fair elections in Russia. But until recently, Putin used the facade of democratic institutions to create the illusion of legitimate power. In the 2011 State Duma elections, they tried to attract influential figures to sway public opinion, including priests. Just imagine, priests are paid off to campaign for the ruling party in Russia. In parallel, state employees such as teachers, doctors, and municipal staff were strongly encouraged to vote for United Russia or be threatened with dismissal. Unsurprisingly, additional direct methods of electoral fraud were employed. Carousels. A voter receives a pre-marked ballot at the entrance, uses it to vote, and returns their blank ballot at the exit in exchange for a small reward, sometimes in the form of alcohol. Throw-ins. Election officials at polling stations drop entire bundles of pre-marked ballots into ballot boxes. Absentee ballots. A person receives a stack of absentee ballots to vote in several different polling stations. By employing these tactics, it's possible to create almost any desired result. But that's not all. The state has changed the rules of the game in almost every election. In 2016, the number of observers for each polling station was limited. No more than 2 people from each party or candidate could be assigned. Since 2019, an electronic voting system has been in use, another tool for falsifying election results. To reset Putin's presidential term in 2020, the Central Election Committee held weekly votes on tree stumps, rocks, and out of car trunks. It was done in an attempt to avoid official polling stations and associated election observers. In addition, the Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation brought in foreign observers during the constitutional amendment vote of 2020. But it turned out the international approval was given by long-standing and dear friends of the Kremlin, including representatives of the European far right. In theory, journalists are allowed to be present at polling stations, although only after enduring a complex and lengthy Central Election Committee accreditation procedure. More often than not, independent media correspondents are simply refused entry to polling stations or end up expelled and physically injured. However, thanks in part to observers and independent media, many Russians are now well aware of election fraud. As a result, virtually every major election campaign is accompanied by massive protests and repression. For the first time, a wave of active protests arose after the 2011 State Duma elections. It was the first time observers and journalists monitored voting en masse, and the entire country could see the scale of falsification. Initially, authorities approved the first rallies, but only 6 months later, mass arrests and criminal cases against protesters became the norm. The next wave of protest activity began 5 years later, following an investigation by the Anti-Corruption Foundation into Prime Minister and ex-President Dmitry Medvedev's luxury villas, yachts, and vineyards. The protests lasted a year until the 2018 presidential elections and Vladimir Putin's subsequent inauguration. In addition to police and riot control, protests were dispersed by Cossacks, a military class scattered across southern Russia, retaining some of their traditions from the time of the Tsars of the Russian Empire. In the summer of 2019, another protest movement began before the autumn Moscow City Duma elections. It rose in reaction to the unwillingness of authorities to register candidates they disapprove of, and their desire to imprison inconvenient journalists. A remarkably practical approach: only allow convenient politicians to stand for election. Moving the goalposts and suppressing protests are ideal strategies for Putin. They eliminate stronger opponents and intimidate citizens who disagree with electoral fraud. Imagine the incumbent president of your country is competing in an election against a red-haired opponent. How might they ensure victory? Why not prohibit redheads from running for president? Better yet, outlaw redheads altogether. Simple and effective. That's precisely what happens in Russia. On the eve of the State Duma elections, Russian parliament is urgently considering a law prohibiting the election of Alexey Navalny's supporters. In December 2020, at an annual press conference, Putin said that he is confident there will be interference in the 2021 State Duma elections from the outside. The Russian dictator is clearly talking about the smart voting strategy developed by Alexey Navalny. Unsurprisingly, Putin's Justice Ministry has added the Anti-Corruption Foundation, founded by Navalny, to the register of foreign agents. The FBK and Navalny's headquarters across the country have now been declared extremist organizations. The smart voting strategy is intended to persuade people to vote against United Russia candidates, even if actual opposition figures are not permitted to participate. This strategy has already shown its effectiveness in the Moscow City Duma elections in 2019. In 2020, coordinators of Navalny's headquarters in Tomsk and Novosibirsk, as well as other opposition figures, were elected to municipal parliaments. Of course, the Kremlin dreams about drawing a legitimate, constitutional two-thirds majority in the State Duma for United Russia. However, given Putin and his party's current ratings, even a simple 50% plus one majority looks like an ambitious task and will require a high degree of fraud and falsification. Therefore, of primary interest during upcoming State Duma elections is seeing how effective Alexey Navalny's team is at accomplishing smart voting, given the pressures of unprecedented repression and Navalny's imprisonment. Will they destroy United Russia's monopoly? That question is why the Russian people will follow with as much interest as they have for US presidential elections.